Alright, punks, it's getting hot, it's getting fiery, and it's getting toasty with that announcement from Warhammer the Old World about army lists. Down here in the punker bunker, everything is tranquil and still, but up there, on the surface, there are no end of explosions. A certain punk has got his arse in hot water for going on YouTube and waving around a leaked copy of the Warhammer the Old World Rulebook. His judgment might have been faulty, but on one level, I admire his audacity. You might be getting a bit concerned for me down here in the punker bunker, but don't worry, they don't call me master of the streets for nothing. And even if the world out there is reduced to ash and reduced to ruin, you'll still be getting these transmissions from Dr. Blaxill from Warhammer the Old World. And if the internet goes down, you can find me on shortwave radio or CFAX. Okay, punks, let's talk about army lists, which is what this announcement is all about. Now, since the sun first rose on the old world, spending points and creating an army or a warband and then representing that army list with models on the table was a core part of the Warhammer Fantasy experience. Indeed, there are some players, and you know who you are, who enjoy creating army lists perhaps as much as they do fighting battles and painting miniatures. And so therefore, it's got to be both fun and strategic and tactical and lead to balanced, enjoyable battles. Now, you might consider creating army lists to represent the models that you happen to have available, to perhaps give you instructions on what regiments or war machines or characters you should paint next to put into your army, or perhaps you're just someone that enjoys creating army lists whether you've got those models or not. Perhaps it's an army that's designed to beat one particular player at the club who's given you a few workings over recently. Perhaps it's a themed army list, maybe something fluffy based on a particular troop type, or maybe from a particular part of, for example, the Forest of Lauren or something, where particular sorts of troops are maybe more commonly found. Maybe equally you think about it from a competitive point of view, that you're taking your army to fight in a series of 5 battles, and you've got to be able to take on all comers. You've got to be able to deal with skirmishing wood elves coming from the trees or big blocks of zombies and skeletons. And so maybe that's your kind of jam when it comes to army selection. Or you may be one of those people for whom army selection actually is a little bit of an irritating inconvenience that gets in the way of you actually fighting battles. But most people, I think, take some enjoyment from army selection, and even for those who don't, we should make it as an enjoyable experience as possible so that we can get down to actually warhammering on the tabletop as quickly as possible. Now, at high-level competitive play, building your army is probably as important as how you actually control those armies on the table. Certain sorts of armies obviously have strengths, obviously have weaknesses. Being able to change up your army according to what other players might be bringing. For example, if fast cavalry have become very popular, if artillery has become very popular, thinking out about counters to those things that you're able to actually supply with models in your collection, all part of the continuous back and forth that goes into competitive wargaming. Now, I think that older editions of Warhammer Fantasy have had perhaps more flexible kind of army creation rules. So if we look at 4th and 5th edition, we have a 25% minimum stipulation for regiments, not really on what kind of regiments, a 50% stipulation for characters, and then up to 25% war machines, up to 25% allies. Now, in those days, those army selection criteria were very, very broad only and didn't really operatively place huge restrictions on what you could bring to the table. Only dialed down the outer walls of extremists just a little bit, and you could still have some pretty crazy armies that existed on the table. Now, when it came to 6th edition, army selection, I think, became a lot more controlled. And controlled, I would say, generally in a quite good way. First of all, you were limited by your number of actual characters, lords and heroes in those days. In a 2,000 point game of 6th edition, only allowed either a level 4 wizard or a kind of combat lord, but not both. a 25%, sorry, not 25%, a minimum stipulation of core units was there in 6th edition, and also only certain numbers of slots of special and rare. Now, when this wound into 8th edition, there were limitations on special and rare picks in terms of numbers, but also some percentages which harken back to 4th and 5th edition also came in as well. So in 8th edition, you don't have to take a certain number of core units as you did in 6th, but you must spend 25% of your points value on those units. And ditto, there were percentages limits there for characters as well. And we have here a very, very interesting document which shows us all of the options that are available to a Bratonian army. Now, they say that 2,000 points is what you would call a sort of a normal sized game. Now, of course, there's nothing to stop you playing larger points values than that. But because they've got certain limitations on certain character types, and that doesn't seem to actually vary with the number of points in your game, I think they've got 2,000 points as the kind of sweet spot that they're going to, in a sense, recommend and encourage you to fight. Although, of course, there's nothing to stop you playing in smaller or larger kind of games. But nonetheless, I think there is usually what you might call a sweet spot for the kind of size of game that is perhaps compatible with the kind of troops in the game, the space they take up on the table, vis-a-vis how large a table is, etc., before you have to start getting a little bit funky. Now in 8th edition, 2,400 or 2,500 was kind of the norm. In this, going back to 2,000, which is perhaps a little more what it was like in 6th edition, 4th edition, 5th edition. Now, let's have a little look at this kind of grand army, which we see here for Bratonia. Now, one very important point, and there are many important points about this, is that this is what you would call a generic or standard kind of grand army composition. There are things called the armies of infamy, which apparently change some of these things up quite a bit. It says at the end of the article that in the Bratonian army of infamy, you can take the forbidden Border Prince's beach-loading bombard. I have a painted beach-loading bombard, so I'm very excited to see that. A re-engagement there with the old forbidden arts of Bratonia and black powder. Now, in the normal army, which is, we assume, the one that is probably going to be the one that we see on tournament tables and that most players who are not fighting themed armies will use, we see some very interesting points. Now, the first thing is about familiarity. All of the troop types that were represented in the Bratonian 6th edition army book are all here in this grand army composition. But there are a few rather important changes that we should discuss. Now, first of all, characters. 50% for that you can spend on these. Again, that's like in previous editions, although in actual fact, Bratonians in 4th and 5th edition were actually allowed up to 75% characters and had one more hero slot in 6th edition. Just a minor sort of detail there, but 50% is what we are used to for the vast majority of armies in the vast majority of editions. Now, the Bratonians find that they actually have more in the way of lord choices, because we now have, as well as the prophetess, we have the duke and the baron, rather than just the Bratonian lord. Probably the Bratonian lord is more analogous to the baron, who is slightly lesser than the duke. The duke has a much more impressive combat stat line, which we'll come to look at in just a moment. Now, those lords are limited, but we don't have any limits on the more minor characters, what would have been called heroes in old money. We can have as many paladins and as many damsels and as many sergeant at arms as we want. Now, I'm assuming that the sergeant at arms is a peasant character, which is something that they had in 9th Age, but we have not had previously represented in Warhammer for Bratonians. That's really nice because it gives the peasants just a little bit more in the way of potential personality, and maybe, indeed, could lead you to have an army which was largely peasant-based. Now we've actually got a guy who can perhaps, lead your peasants, and while he won't be as good a fighter as the paladin, might give the unit some specific kind of bonuses that might, give them certain sorts of advantages, maybe in terms of formations, or maybe in terms of some other kinds of rules. That's probably what I think the sergeant at arms probably will do. Now, Looking at the other kind of units, we find everything the same in core, apart from the addition of these foot knights, of course, as we would expect. With special, we find again exactly the same, except we find the addition there of squires. Now, squires did used to exist in 4th edition and 5th edition. They were, in 6th edition, replaced by skirmishing peasant bowmen. And so what I expect squires to be will be a skirmishing-like kind of unit, probably armed with bows. I don't know if in the fluff they're going to be dudes that could conceivably apprentice to be knights in the way that they were very vaguely in 4th edition and 5th edition. Whereas in 6th edition, the yeomen that sort of replaced the squires were very much, on a different kind of class, above the other peasants, but clearly lower than a knight. So interesting to see squires kind of returning there, even though it might just be a change of name from skirmishing peasant bowmen. In the rare slot, again, we find Grail Knights and Trebuchets. Trebuchets limited 0 to 1 per 2,000 points, so you can have 2 Trebs in a 2,000 point army. Again, pretty similar there. Then we see some real changes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. We see 25% being spendable on allies, really going back to 4th edition here. And then also 20% to be spent on mercenaries. Now, who are these mercenaries, we might ask? Are they dogs of war? Or will they be more generic kind of mercenaries? And also, am I allowed to spend both of those allowances together? So could I potentially have up to 45% of my Bratonian army not being Bratonians at all? Whoa, that would be very, very interesting and very curious indeed, especially because actually in previous editions, Bratonians were not allowed to have allies at all. It said in the 5th edition army book that Bratonians always fight alone, even if massively outnumbered. Obviously, they're a little bit more pragmatic in this earlier time. Perhaps that might have something to do with the beach-loading bombard also representing, for some Bratonians, a concession to pragmatism. We now go on, and we'll talk more about allies and mercenaries in just a minute, to some profiles that we find. Now, first of all, we see the Lords of Bratonia. Now, we get some interesting stat lines here. Now, as I say, the Baron remains very much the same as what the Bratonian Lord used to be. He's got a point less of initiative, but apart from that, he's exactly the same as the old Bratonian Lord. It's the Duke where we start to really see some difference. Now, this Duke has got weapons skill 7, which is more than before. Perhaps that seems kind of appropriate enough, because Bratonians, you would imagine, would have, sort of combat lords that were a little bit more skilled at arms than the Empire, for example. He's got strength 5. Oh, that's pretty impressive. He's got 4 wounds, and he's got 5 attacks. He's got a stat line that, to be honest, is not that far off a Chaos Lord. So he's looking really, really meaty. That unless those other kinds of races, like for example Warriors of Chaos, also get a buff to their lord choices, this Bratonian Duke, especially given he can choose virtues as well and 100 points of magic items, might be one of the most fearsome kind of combat characters you might see on a competitive tabletop. And probably helps restore the Bratonians to having that kind of real monster kind of single character, which is perhaps appropriate for their lore, but perhaps they didn't really have in, certainly by 8th edition, because, vampires, Chaos Lords, arguably dwarves, had probably better characters than Bratonian did. Certainly, the Duke undoubtedly makes Bratonian characters great again. We see also some other profiles as well that I think are worth discussing. And perhaps the Hippogriff is maybe one of the most interesting ones we've seen so far. Not because Hippogriffs are particularly interesting, but because of certain things that this reveals. Now, the first thing that's very noteworthy, the Hippogriff looks, by the way, in combat potential, pretty similar to how he was before. He's on a 50-50mm base, which is probably smaller than what I would have expected, given the general inflation of base sizes. And he also doesn't seem to have any armor penetration marked on his profile, despite him having a strength of 5. And this seems very interesting to me. Now, we've seen armor penetration noted on certain weapons. So, for example, the Morning Star being -1 AP, the Lance being -2 AP, on the turn that you charge. But this Hippogriff doesn't have any armor penetration marked on his profile. He's simply got a strength of 5. So that would kind of be a bit curious in a way, wouldn't it? If the Hippogriff with a big, powerful monster, bashing stuff with armor, someone with light armor, and them still getting a 6+ armor save against it. Unless there's something else there with armor penetration that's perhaps off the profiles, or the generic strength of a troop reduces armor penetration by 1 for every point above 3, which has not been concerned, the Hippogriff would seem to have armor penetration 0, which would be a very curious situation for a big monster. That a man with a Morning Star is going to smash up armor more effectively than a big monster with big kind of talons and claws. And that would be interesting. The Hippogriff simply adds wounds to your profile. That's very interesting. In other words, we have something that happened in the end times but did not quite happen in 8th edition, the formal merging, like a corporate merger, of monster and rider. Now, many people will like this change because it is, just something a little bit more elegant. Your Baron with 3 wounds or your Duke with 4 goes on a Griffin and he goes up to 6 wounds or 7 wounds. And, the monster and the rider simply have 1 profile and they both get taken off together. In previous editions, your monster could die first or your rider could die first. In a sense, this also used to, of course, be the case with things like chariots going back into older editions. You could kill the creatures pulling the chariot, meaning the crew had to get out and fight on foot. You could kill the crew and then the chariot would go out of control. All those rather interesting things were simulated. Later, chariots just got combined profiles, and so that disappeared, although it was probably more elegant in game terms. Monsters and riders were a bit more of a holdout. They kept their separate profiles, which did create certain kind of confusions in game terms, or certain inconsistencies, or certain complexities. Now they're merging them just like chariots were. Now, if you ask me, am I a fan of this change? I would say no, because I like the simulation of being able to separate monster and rider. I like the idea of them being potentially independent, one dying before the other, just as I liked that with chariots. It's not really a very big change, and it's a change I think could really have predicted, but nonetheless, it's still notable that still happens. It does have some importance in game terms, because when you think about it, if you have a monster that's merged with the rider, then in a sense, the whole creature develops some advantages. So, for example, if the lord riding the griffin, or the hippogriff in this case, has got heavy armor and shield, that's a 4+ armor save. Presumably that transfers to the mount. We see here that the hippogriff actually already has heavy armor of its own, and it can purchase barding, which presumably gives it a pip more of the armor. Now, the only way of understanding that, it seems to me, is that unless the heavy armor and shield of the Duke or the Baron riding the hippogriff becomes irrelevant because he's on a monster, and then that would be very strange, I assume that the armor save of the hippogriff will stack with the rider. And so therefore, if you've got a 4+ armor save for heavy armor and shield for the guy on top, presumably, given the griffin's got heavy armor and it's got barding, that could get you up to a 1+ armor save, in theory. Otherwise, I can't really see any point for the hippogriff having heavy armor, or it being noted as such, because his rider will always have heavy armor himself as well, unless, of course, the hippogriff can be ridden by a prophetess who doesn't have heavy armor. So, this is all a little bit speculative and kind of anal, but nonetheless quite important there in game terms. Now, of course, in 8th edition, monster and rider kind of became a bit rubbish because of artillery. And now we've got artillery only doing D3+1 runes, and we've got a merged profile. And so I don't know how they'll really work out in this. It will be very interesting to see. The hippogriff only has a fly range of 9, I should say, instead of 10 or 12 in the old days. And so that perhaps suggests that we're going to get some different speeds when it comes to flying creatures. That's pretty cool. I think a Pegasus should probably be faster than a hippogriff, whereas in previous editions, if you flew, even if you were like a fell bat or a carrion or something like that, you were still as swift as a Pegasus or a grey eagle or something. Now I think we'll have some variation in these speed, which also is cool as far as I'm concerned. Now the next profile we have, on which there is probably more to say, are the Menat Arms. Now, Menat Arms, in 8th edition certainly, were trash. because, they were overpriced. They were less good than pretty much any other infantry that could go in hordes. They really weren't worth taking. They were also just not very interesting. They had no special rules that made them stand out. They were just basically halberdiers with kind of worse weapon skill. Now, these men-at-arms here do have some interesting special rules with them. There are no points values mentioned here, unfortunately, so we can't, for example, work out, how many men-at-arms are going to fit into one Grail Knight, for example. I mean, if the men-at-arms were, say, 4 points, or whether they were 6 points, that might have actually been a meaningful piece of analysis, but we don't know. All we can see is their profiles and some special rules. The profile is exactly the same as before. They only have weapon skill 2, perhaps representing that these are literally kind of drilled levies who have maybe had like a few days of training. They're not, they're absolutely nothing approaching professional soldiers, so they are correspondingly really rather a lot worse. Now, the men-at-arms most interesting things about them is, first of all, they have the rule called Horde. Now, we don't know what this does in Warhammer the Old World. In the old days, any unit could be a Horde in 8th edition, and it meant the 3rd rank could fight as well as the 2nd. I would wager, probably quite a lot of money, that this will mean that the 2nd rank can fight, whereas it can't at the moment. So your men-at-arms can get a few more, admittedly rather low-quality attacks swinging. I would also expect that units that have the Horde special rule might be those kind of ones that are quite cheap, quite tar-pity, not very elite, which gives them a little bit of a bite back because they're able to bring more attacks to bear. Now, the men-at-arms have 2 kinds of unit champion. One is the yeoman, whose most significant characteristic perhaps is that he adds an extra leadership to the unit. But the other one is the Grail monk. Now, the Grail monk is significant really for no other reason that he can have something called the Blessed Triptych. And this is very intriguing. What this does is gives the men-at-arms the Stubborn special rule. And what the Stubborn special rules does in this is it means that the men-at-arms, if they fail a break test, instead of actually failing it, they simply fall back in good order instead. Now, they also have a rule called Shield Wall, which means that instead of falling back, they are able to give ground reluctantly and thus deprive a following up enemy of his charging bonuses. Now, I assume that those 2 things stack. So, if I run into the men-at-arms with my cavalry unit or whatever it is, thump them by an absolute massive margin, and they fail their break test, not only does that get commuted to falling back in good order because of the Blessed Triptych that they have on their Grail monk, that fallback in good order is then commuted to give ground reluctantly as well. So, there's a unit there that is unbreakable for the first round in combat. All I can do is push it. Now, of course, I might be able to kill the Grail monk if I can allow to attack him separately. And if he confers his bonus only at the point where the break test is taken, perhaps I can ping off the Grail monk and stamp all over his Blessed Triptych, and then the men-at-arms are no longer going to benefit from this stubborn rule that they otherwise would do. Now, this then brings, I think, us onto some maybe broader kind of points that come out of this, and I have a few more general points that I think are important. One I'm going to call Grindhammer. Now, a very important previous announcement, one of the most important ones, was that all units have a form of steadfast, which is to say that they do not break and flee unless they fail a break test on their unmodified leadership test. We then have a distinction between whether you fail it on your modified or your unmodified leadership test, distinguishing between whether you give ground, which is to say you simply are pushed backwards 2 inches and your enemy, if he follows up, doesn't get charging bonuses, and falling back in good order, where you again go 2 inches backwards and your enemy pursues into you and gets their charging bonuses. Now, because all troops have got this kind of form of steadfast, it's going to be much rarer that you see units breaking and fleeing in this game than it was before. Now we're starting to also see this stubborn rule as well. And we've seen this for Grail Knights, and we've seen it for Men-at-Arms. That means they actually can't fail a break test on the first round of combat. They always only fall back in good order, or in the case of the Shield Wall, actually just give ground. So you actually have an unbreakable unit, an invincible one-turn blocker, unless you're able to ping off that Grail Monk, that is. Now, just in general, I suppose, the more I see of this, the more that the way I think this game will feel on the table will be troops not actually breaking and fleeing that often and being pushed around quite a lot. And that will create a very, very different feel to what Warhammer kind of looks like. Now, this all feels really rather grindy in its nature. Now, a crucial, absolutely crucial rule with this is the role of leadership. Now, in previous editions, for break tests, you were always able to use your general's inspiring presence within, say, 12 inches of him using his leadership, and also the BSB's rule to be able to reroll break tests. This was also other psychology tests from 7th edition onwards. Now, assuming those rules are still in, and we know that battle standard bearers still exist as well, it's going to be the case that unless you are failing something like a 9 rerollable, which is probably about the leadership that most armies are going to have, your units are simply not going to break. That we're going to have, this kind of grind fest where units are gradually being pushed back rather than actually breaking. Now, as well as just, I suppose, a general kind of doubt about this, because I quite like troops breaking and fleeing. I like how sometimes in Warhammer you can have these decisive moments where a whole unit of infantry is, say, swept aside by cavalry. The point is this. It seems as though, and this would apply whatever the stuff with General and BSB, that even if I thump your unit by 10 with a massive night charge, or I just pip you out by 1, you have exactly the same chance of breaking and fleeing. The only difference to that is the difference between falling back and giving ground. Now, I think that that might create a situation where you have quite grindy combats, and the point where a unit flees might just be an occasion where, as I say, they lose combat by 1, but your dice come out big. There won't really be a correspondence between where a regiment is absolutely smashed in combat and they're more likely to run away. The only distinction is between this giving ground and falling back. And that distinction has to be incredibly meaningful to be able to simulate that kind of pendulum-like fluidity where you get a really decisive combat that goes, in one side's favour, maybe that's taken quite a lot of sort of manoeuvring to get into a position to do, and it results in something that feels satisfactory. I say as a Bratonian player that there is nothing like getting your prime charge in there and watching that mob of infantry run away only to be cut down by your knights. Now, it might be the case that I thunder into you, you simply stick, and then in a subsequent combat round you beat me by 1 or I beat you by 1 and then you fail a break test and then we, do this whole flee and pursuit thing. I don't like, in theory, the way that really kind of sounds on the battlefield. So, just take, I think, a little bit of a kind of a look at that, or I'm keeping my eyes open for this Grindhammer kind of phenomenon. And the more stubborn we see in here, the more important I think that that is probably going to be. But I like the fact that Men at Arms have got these kind of options, by the way, as being charge absorbers. I also like, in a kind of fluffy way, that they've got like a kind of a monk that can kind of go with them. I wish monks were a whole regiment, actually. Other kinds of points that I think we find here. My next point is really about these army lists, and especially about allies. Incidentally, there was one point I didn't mention with the Bratonians. There were a few troops in there I would have liked to have seen them bring back. I would have liked to have seen crossbowmen. I would have liked to have seen the bombard, although we have got that with the Forbidden Border Prince's army list. I'd have also liked to have seen a Blitzer as well. I think that's another kind of Bratonian sort of war machine that we might have. I also would have liked to have seen Hammerolts, like sort of, kind of outlaws, sort of merry men, if you like. So a few things that weren't there, but perhaps those sorts of troops will be there in these kind of armies of infamy. And Bratonians will have a little bit more variety than they presently do. Bratonians, generally speaking, only have a very small selection of troops. I was hoping to see 1 or 2 more of them added in this army list. Perhaps they'll be in the expansion army list to give us our variety. Speaking of variety, it seems as though some of that is going to come from these allies. Now, allies aren't really everyone's cup of tea. Now, as I say, they are a callback to previous editions of the game. There are also, of course, these suspicious and firm allies. So, if it's a high elf or an empire allied contingent, it's not a suspicious alliance, which perhaps means that the allied dudes can use your Bratonian duke's leadership. That might be one way of simulating it as it was in the past. Whereas for the dwarves or for the wood elves, they're suspicious allies. And so perhaps there won't be those kind of reinforcing bonuses. Now, a whole quagmire of questions appear with allies. Now, on a superficial level, allies are some things that are cool to kind of simulate. So, I tend to think about Bratonians and Bratonia being, net bordering Lauren Forest. And, I don't mind the idea of perhaps some wood elves striking a bargain, to maybe see off a kind of common foe with some Bratonian knights in the vicinity. And while they don't exactly trust each other, they do have, reasonably good diplomatic kind of relations, because after all, they do occupy the same kind of realms. So I like the fluff potential of allies. I think it could be, really, really kind of cool in many instances. But in game terms, there are all sorts of problems created by this. So first of all, look, you've got 25% allies. That would be 500 points in a 2,000 point game. Does that allied contingent have to follow the army list restrictions of that kind of allied faction? Does it have to have a certain number of core units, or does it have to spend 125 points on core? Are there limitations to war machines, to characters? I would assume, because the points values are so small with ally, only 500, that they are not going to have to take anything with those kind of restrictions, because otherwise there wouldn't really be very much flexibility in what you could bring in allies. You'd pretty much be limited to core units, or not be able to take, say, a lord or a hero level character. I don't know. So if you are allowed to take those more funky choices, you could end up with a wood elf army having, say, 2 empire cannons that happen to go along with it. That my Bratonians, who might be, limited in a certain kinds of respects. When it came to, for example, war machines. Oh, maybe there are 2 organ guns that happen to go with them. From some dwarf mountain hold that have been wheeled into Bratonia for some very inexplicable kind of reason. That sounds a bit dubious to me. Perhaps the height of that kind of abuse could be dwarves. No magic. Just get on the phone to Ulvern and, get some high elf mage to come over on his jet scooter to come and, come and give you a dwarf some magical backup and fire a few fiery convocations off into the enemy as well. That would be very, very undwarven. But these kind of things, of course, can happen with allies. Now, so they create all sorts of potential kind of balance issues for competitive kind of play, but flexibility when it comes to fluff. Now, there are also these mercenaries. Now, 20% on mercenaries, which I assume is cumulative to the 25% on allies. Now, as I say, who are the mercenaries? Is it dogs of war? Are we going to be seeing Rico's Republican Guard? Are we going to be seeing the marksmen of Miragliano? Are we going to be seeing the Gallopagone? All very exciting. Now, for those who don't remember them, Dogs of War were primarily a Tilean group of mercenary regiments kind of for hire that could be fielded in any army or could make up an army themselves. Many of them were, very fluffy, very interesting, had their own kind of stories, and also because they were from parts of the old world that didn't actually have those kind of army lists, especially Tilea, to some extent Astala as well. Of course, these mercenaries also create all of the same kind of balance issues that you might have with allies. So, for example, the Wood Elves, maybe as well as their 2 allied Empire cannon, might also have 2 mercenary Gallopagons with them as well. Suddenly we see an orgy of black powder in this Wood Elf contingent, as these generals from Lorraine start getting very, very pragmatic. Now, I think that we can conclude, though, fairly comprehensively, that this means that there's going to be a lot of house ruling required to play this game competitively. This seems much more like 4th edition to me. The army lists seem very flexible. Also, the fact that you've got mercenaries, the fact that you've got allies, means that, we can bring all sorts of crazy stuff to the table. It might be, in a sense, a little bit like in Age of Sigmar, where I have a limited understanding of that game, but it seems to me that you're able to pick from a much, greater kind of what you would call sort of alliance of, generally good or generally kind of evil, or destruction or chaos or whatever it might be. And you can more easily have, undead and chaos fighting alongside each other, etc. My knowledge of Age of Sigmar is a little bit out of date, but that's what I understand it to be in a sense like. A little bit more, kind of flexible, a bit more kind of multiversy, a bit more of a, sort of springboard to your imagination, on which I suppose formal army lists perhaps create some, restrictions and some walls. But as I say, for competitive play, clearly these allies and these mercenaries would be massively abusable. And so unless they're really well balanced or there are very specific rules governing their selection, I imagine that in competitive play there will simply be a sign at the outset that says no allies. I also think that probably these themed army lists might also be disallowed as well, although we'll have to see what they contain. So there might be different kind of levels, I suppose, that exist within the game. One is the kind of, in a sense, have your cake and eat it, everything goes kind of style, where you've got the allies, you've got the mercenaries, you've got the armies of infamy, you can represent what you fancy kind of on the table, and that's going to really suit especially fluff kind of gamers. And then you've got the much more limited kind of selection, where you have a much smaller number of troop types and an army being internally balanced, which is probably what you're going to see in competitive play. That would be really cool if it was the case. Although as a Bretonian, I do wish we had perhaps one or two more troop choices in our kind of core army, because there's not really a lot more, and Bretonians have got so much less choice than all of the other armies that I would have hoped to have seen a few more things there. So I think this is intriguing. And I do think that it probably makes it clearer to me that the overall conception of this game is perhaps less orientated maybe towards competitive play. That they have very much in their mind as their core target perhaps, a more generalist kind of audience, a more fluff kind of audience, that, they don't want to limit too much in terms of what they can do and what they can bring. But hopefully they haven't forgotten about the tournamenters here as well. And hopefully there are just a few little kind of house rules that we could put in about not allowing you to select certain things that will make this game fit for competitive play. There are some doubts I generally have about some of the rules, I admit, like for example paying for your wheeling out of your charge. That will obviously create no sorts of end of arguments on a competitive table, and so perhaps they might have to be house ruled as well. I guess we'll see. But my impression is that I think Games Workshop might be quite relaxed about, the tournament kind of crowd having to house rule things. At the end of the day, certainly with Warhammer Fantasy, I'm not quite sure so much about 40k, we've had to be doing house rules pretty much whatever edition it's been. And so there's a big culture of, tournament organisers creating their own kinds of rules for particular competitive play. Now, there are just literally kind of two other things that I thought I'd kind of mention, which are actually both unrelated to this kind of announcement. Now, the first is actually another announcement that appeared just the other day, which is the publication of the first Warhammer the Old World novel, The Lords of the Lance by Graham McNeill. Now, I'm not necessarily a big fan of Warhammer novels in general. I think the Genevieve trilogy is terrific, by far the best in my opinion. And I also quite like some of the Gotrex and Felix books for, and other sorts of reasons. But most of the rest of the Warhammer novels that I have read haven't really been that great. But this Lords of the Lance novel, I don't know anything about it as a kind of a story, but it's set in Warhammer the Old World. In other words, at the time of the War of the Three Emperors, before the founding of the Colleges of Magic, etc. Now, there's some stuff on the article with kind of Graham McNeill and how it was and how he felt about writing a story that's set, in the old world. And in a sense, the old world as it now is, the earlier time period, rather than in the end times. And, if that created some sort of restrictions kind of for him. And it seems from what I'm reading that actually it represented maybe some actually opportunities, if anything. The fact that magic isn't codified and that there's, some creative expression in terms of what magic can even mean was one such thing. Another point that I thought I saw in there, and this is just an instinct, and, if this is true, then, you should give Dr. Blaxill some credit for hearing this here first. He talks about the traditions of Bratonia. Now, Bratonia is, of course, a very traditional kind of land, and so, 200 years before the end times, things are going to be, in many respects, the same. But he did talk about one thing in there, which I picked up on, which is who can be a knight. Now, that's very, very interesting, particularly because I note two other things. One of the Foot Knight models, and I saw this mentioned on the channel Discourse Minis, and I looked very carefully at it, one of those Foot Knights is probably a woman. Which is very interesting. I also think on the Lords of the Lance cover that the red-haired knight riding the Pegasus also looks pretty feminine to me as well. So we might actually be having lady knights in Warhammer the Old World, which would be very, very interesting. Now, in Bratonian fluff so far, there is of course a very, very distinct, kind of code of patriarchal chivalry, whereby women are not allowed to become knights. Sometimes there are some women that pretend to be knights, a tiny number of instances, and then there is, of course, the legend of Ripance, the Leoness. But you see, I think what they might have done here, and this is my suspicion, that they might have used the fact that this is set in an earlier time period to perhaps slightly liberalise that kind of conception of who can become a knight. They may very well say that Bratonia, in the time between the Old World and the End Times, kind of became a bit more patriarchal and conservative and kind of didn't allow women to become knights. But perhaps in this time period, maybe it's a little bit more primordial soupy and a little bit less formed, and perhaps the occasional woman is allowed to kind of, don armour without actually literally having to pretend to be a man. And so this represents a way in which going back in time can slightly allow them to escape some of those kind of narrative binds, which, for many reasons, some of them political, which we won't get into now, they might be able to, have more what you might call sort of representative kind of models on the table, but also not completely throw away those kind of Bratonian kind of ideals of chivalry, which are actually, kind of quite contingent to their identity, but sort of have them, in a sense, maybe being present in this time period, but perhaps becoming more strict later. In a sense, I do kind of, like that as a potential sort of, workaround, in a sense, if they, feel they want to have women knights. Because, it doesn't require retconning any kind of law. It makes everything kind of quite consistent, but still allows them, to introduce this interesting kind of variety. The final thing that I just wanted to mention was actually about the rulebook itself. Now, a certain YouTube channel, or a certain individual on a certain YouTube channel, of course, got photographed holding the Warhammer the Old World book, which suggests that there are amongst the what you would call the commentariat of Warhammer Fantasy some rule books around. So some people will genuinely have read them and will already know what the rules say, even though they will be under non-disclosure agreements to not mention anything about it. I should confirm that I am not one of those people who has had the rustle of the letterbox there from Games Workshop. I do not know anything more than you. I have to say, though, while I understand that, to an extent that kind of has to happen because, they will want, influences and the commentariat to have immediate things to say about the game when it's released, I don't like a debate on a game like this that's driven kind of by rumours of who might know what and who might happen to have know the rules or have seen the rules. At the end of the day, I quite like it when there's an egalitarianism of access to information. I can have my view, you can have your view about these latest kind of snippets of information that we get fed from time to time. And, it's fun having a talk about them. What is utterly corrosive to that kind of debate, though, is the knowledge that actually some people who happen to be a bit closer to kind of the power source know something that everyone else doesn't and have to kind of tap the side of their kind of nose with a knowing kind of raise of the eyebrow. I think that makes the debate much more aristocratic. It makes, those people who happen to be close, as I say, to the aristocracy, closer to the Lord's Chamber, closer to the favoured information, in a sense places them on a different kind of plane to us kind of mere mortals. So, no insider information here, just a bunch of probably incorrect speculation. When this rulebook leak appeared on Facebook, I got rather holier than thou. I said, look, punks! I might lead the race, I might smash your collective faces into the tarmac at every turn, but I am, at the end of the day, still one of you. And if a rulebook were perchance to slide its way into my possession, I would sit on it, and not open it until the release date, so as to be one with you, my fellow man. And then a great light shone from the sky and said, Dr. Blaxill, you are forgiven for all of your numerous sins, you are saved. Ah, wonderful. All right, punks. Thus ends this transmission, and maybe even transmissions for the year 2023, and what a year it's been. So from me, Chantal the Prophetess, and the wretched demon, I wish you and your house a wonderful Christmas and a very happy New Year. But don't expect me to go easy on you.